It took 39 seconds. Not 39 seconds of shaking, 39 seconds between two separate catastrophes. At 4 minutes and 33 seconds past 6 in the evening, on June 24th, the ground beneath northern Venezuela tore open, a magnitude 7.2. That alone would have been the worst earthquake the country had seen in a generation. And then, before the dust from the first one had even begun to settle, before a single rescue worker could move, the earth did it again. 39 seconds later, a magnitude 7.5. The strongest earthquake to strike Venezuela in more than 100 years. 2 major earthquakes, one night, less than a minute apart. By the time you're watching this, the official death toll has climbed past 1,400, more than 3,000 injured, over 50,000 reported missing, and the United States Geological Survey's own casualty model, the one called Pager, put the realistic range in the tens of thousands, with a real probability the final number climbs past 100,000. Those are not numbers from a disaster movie. That is a fault line you have probably never heard of, doing exactly what the science said it could do. Here's what I want you to understand by the end of this video. I'm going to show you why 2 earthquakes can happen 39 seconds apart, and why that is not a coincidence, and not a weapon, no matter what you've seen online. I'm going to show you the fault that did this, a fault that has a near twin running right under the state of California, and I'm going to show you the second threat, the one that kills people long after the shaking stops, that almost nobody is talking about. The truth here is stranger, and frankly more unsettling, than any conspiracy theory you'll find in the comments of another video. This is the Horizon Lab, where we don't sell you the panic, we show you the data. Let's get into it. And before we do, if you care about getting the real science instead of the fear, subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep doing this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because some of you watching right now live directly on top of the fault I'm about to describe. Let's start with exactly what happened, because the timeline itself is the first clue to the whole mystery. The date was Wednesday, June 24th, 2026. In Venezuela, that day is a national holiday. It marks the Battle of Carabobo, a turning point in the country's fight for independence. So this matters, and I'll come back to it, because it meant something simple and terrible. People were not at work, they were home, they were inside the very buildings that were about to come down. The first event struck at 6:04 and 33 seconds in the evening, local time. The US Geological Survey logged it as a magnitude 7.2. The epicenter sat in the region between the towns of Yumare and San Felipe in northwestern Venezuela, at a depth of around 20 kilometers. Shallow enough that the energy didn't have far to travel before it hit the surface, and the cities, and the people. Now hold that thought, because 39 seconds later, at 6:05 and 12 seconds, the ground ruptured again, a magnitude 7.5, centered in the same area, the Yumare to Moron corridor, even shallower, at a depth of around 10 kilometers. Let me put those two numbers side by side, because the difference is bigger than it looks. A magnitude 7.5 is not a little more powerful than a 7.2. The scale is logarithmic. Each full step up is about 32 times more energy released. So that jump from a 7.2 to a 7.5 in less than a minute meant the second quake unleashed somewhere close to 3 times the energy of the first. The first one cracked the buildings, the second one finished them. The US Geological Survey did something it does not do for most earthquakes on Earth. For both events, it issued a red alert through the Pager system. Pager stands for Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response, and a red alert is the highest level there is. It means the agency's models predict, and I'm quoting the framework here, high casualties and extensive damage, and that the disaster is likely widespread. For the magnitude 7.5, Pager estimated a 29% chance of 1,000 to 10,000 deaths, a 43% chance of 10,000 to 100,000 deaths, and a 22% chance of more than 100,000. Read that again. The single most likely outcome the model flagged was a death toll between 10,000 and 100,000 people. The hardest hit place was the coastal state of La Guaira, just north of the capital Caracas. Buildings pancaked. Whole apartment blocks folded into themselves with families still inside. 13 hospitals were damaged across the country, which means the places meant to treat the injured were themselves broken. Within hours, Venezuela's acting president declared a state of emergency. The government ordered the national gas supply shut off to stop collapsed buildings from turning into fireballs. And rescue teams started coming. Not just Venezuelan crews, teams from Mexico, El Salvador, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and, as we'll see, from the United States. Because this event was so large that it pulled in help from across an entire hemisphere. But the question that the seismologists fixated on, the question that should fixate you too, was not how big, it was how. How do you get two great earthquakes 39 seconds apart? That's where this gets genuinely strange. So why twice? Why 39 seconds? To answer that, I need to introduce you to a word that's about to do a lot of heavy lifting in this story. The word is doublet, an earthquake doublet. It means two earthquakes of similar, large magnitude happening very close together in both time and space, where the second one is not just a normal aftershock. It's a co-equal, a second heavyweight punch, not the wobble after the first. Most of the time, when a big earthquake hits, what follows is a long tail of aftershocks, smaller, each one a fraction of the energy of the main shock. That's the normal pattern. What happened in Venezuela was different. The second quake was bigger than the first. The 7.5 came after the 7.2. The main shock followed the foreshock by less than a minute and dwarfed it. Here's the mechanism, and I'm going to use something physical so it actually lands. Think of a fault line as a long row of dominoes that are jammed together under enormous pressure, held in place only by friction. When the first section finally slips, it releases its own stored energy, but it also does something to the section right next to it. It shoves it, two different ways at once. The first way is what scientists call static stress transfer. When one block of rock lurches sideways, it permanently changes the squeeze on the rock beside it. Imagine pulling one brick out of a tightly packed wall. Every brick around it suddenly carries a load it wasn't carrying a second ago. Some of those neighboring patches of fault, already near their breaking point after decades of slow strain, get pushed over the edge. The second way is faster and almost violent. It's called dynamic stress transfer. The seismic waves from that first rupture don't just travel outward to shake cities, they travel along the fault itself, and as they pass over the next locked segment, they jostle it, hammer it, in real time, so you get a 1-2 effect. The permanent shove plus the passing shockwave. Together, on a fault that was already loaded and ready, they can trigger a second rupture almost immediately. 39 seconds is almost immediately. And there's a detail here that's so clean it's almost eerie. When two earthquakes happen that close together, the seismic waves from the second one arrive, while the waves from the first are still rolling across the planet's seismometers. The signals literally overlap. They stack on top of each other. Which means in the first hours, even the experts had a hard time cleanly separating the two events in the data. Some scientists raised a genuine question, and it's still an open one. Was this truly two separate ruptures 39 seconds apart? Or was it one single, complicated rupture that jumped from one fault segment to another in a fraction of a minute, behaving like two? The US Geological Survey is cataloguing it as two distinct events. Other analyses suggest it may be better understood as a single complex rupture of roughly magnitude 7.6. That disagreement isn't a flaw in the science. It's the science working in real time, on data that is genuinely difficult, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend anyone has every answer 48 hours in. What is not in dispute is the physics of the trigger. One fault segment broke, and it handed its stress to the next one, and the next one broke too. No mystery technology required. Just rock, and friction, and a plate boundary that had been winding up like a spring for a very long time. So let's go find that spring. Let's find the fault almost nobody can name. Northern Venezuela sits on top of one of the most underappreciated tectonic battlegrounds on the planet. Here's the setup. You have two enormous slabs of the Earth's crust grinding past each other. To the north, the Caribbean plate. To the south, the South American plate. And they are not slamming head-on the way you might picture two cars in a crash. They are sliding past each other, sideways, in what geologists call a transform boundary. The Caribbean plate is creeping eastward relative to South America at a rate of around 20 millimeters a year, about the width of your thumb every single year. That sounds slow. It is slow, and that slowness is exactly the problem, because the strain doesn't release smoothly. It catches, it locks, it builds for decades, for centuries, until something gives. The specific structure that gave on June 24th is the San Sebastián fault system, and if you've never heard that name, you are in very good company, because it gets almost none of the attention that the famous faults get. The San Sebastián runs mostly offshore, along the north-central coast of Venezuela, just off the edge of the Venezuelan coastal range. There's a short onshore segment near Simón Bolívar International Airport, the main airport serving Caracas, where it's sometimes called the Bruscas Fault. Farther to the east, it connects toward another major fault called the El Pilar. Together, this offshore system makes up around 400 kilometers of the boundary between those two great plates. And here is the word that matters most. This is a right-lateral strike-slip fault. Let me unpack that, because it's the key that unlocks the rest of this video. Strike-slip means the two sides slide horizontally past each other, rather than one riding up over the other. Right-lateral means if you stood on one side and looked across the fault, the other side would appear to move to your right. That is the exact same style of faulting, the exact same geometry, as one of the most famous and feared fault lines in the world. I'll give you a second to guess which one. The US Geological Survey described the mainshock plainly. Shallow strike-slip faulting near a complex plate boundary along the San Sebastián fault system. No exotic language, no mystery. A known fault on a known boundary, behaving exactly the way that kind of fault behaves when the strain finally wins. The reason it was so deadly wasn't that it was unexpected to scientists. It's that it was shallow, it was strong, it struck a region packed with vulnerable buildings, and it struck on a holiday evening when those buildings were full. This same plate boundary system has a long memory. It has produced large, destructive earthquakes before, going back well over a century, which tells you this was not a freak event. It was a chapter in a very old story. A story that, it turns out, has a sequel waiting under the United States. Because that right-lateral strike-slip fault I just described, it has a twin, and that twin runs straight through California. The San Andreas fault. If you live in the United States, that's the one you know, the one in the movies, the one that's supposed to drop California into the sea someday, which, for the record, it absolutely will not do, and we'll get to why. But strip away the Hollywood mythology and look at what the San Andreas actually is, mechanically. It is a right-lateral strike-slip fault, marking the boundary where two plates slide horizontally past each other. The Pacific plate, grinding northwest, past the North American plate. Sound familiar? It should, because that's the same machine that just devastated Venezuela. Same type of fault, same right-lateral motion. The only real difference is the speed. The San Sebastián moves at around 20 millimeters a year. The San Andreas moves faster, at around 35 millimeters a year, which, if anything, should not make you feel better. So let's talk about what a fault like this does when it lets go on American soil. Because we have the receipts. We've done this before. In 1857, the southern San Andreas ruptured in what we now call the Fort Tejon earthquake, a magnitude around 7.9. The ground tore for roughly 350 kilometers. In some places, the two sides of the fault shifted by 9 meters. That's nearly 30 feet of sideways motion in a matter of seconds. At the time, that part of California was barely populated, so the death toll was low. That's the only reason it isn't a name every American knows. Then came 1906, San Francisco, a magnitude around 7.9 on the northern San Andreas. The shaking was severe, but it was the fires afterward that finished the city. Estimates of the dead run as high as 3,000. Hundreds of thousands left homeless. A major American city, gutted by the exact same kind of fault that just struck Venezuela. And here's the part that connects the two stories directly. Scientists have understood for a long time that the San Andreas doesn't release all its stress at once. When one segment ruptures, it loads the next one. The southern San Andreas, the stretch near Los Angeles, hasn't had a major rupture since around 1700. It has been quietly storing strain for over 300 years. The US Geological Survey's own long-term models put the odds of a magnitude 7 or greater hitting Southern California in the next few decades at better than 90%. Not if, when. So when you watch the footage from Caracas and La Guaira, the pancaked apartment blocks, the families digging through concrete with their hands, I need you to resist the urge to file it away as something that happens to other people, somewhere far away. The fault that did it is the mechanical cousin of the one running under millions of Americans right now. Venezuela is not a foreign tragedy you can look away from. It is a preview, a real-world, full-scale test of what a shallow, powerful strike-slip earthquake does to a dense, unprepared city. And the lessons buried in that rubble belong to California too. But the threat from this kind of earthquake doesn't stop at the shaking, because this fault, the San Sebastián, runs largely offshore, under the sea, and when the seafloor moves, the ocean moves with it. Which is why, within minutes of the second rupture, an alarm went off, not in Venezuela, but on United States territory. At the same time, families in Caracas were running into the streets. A different kind of warning was lighting up, hundreds of miles to the north. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, which is a US agency, part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, saw the magnitude 7.5 flash across its systems and did exactly what it's built to do. It ran the numbers. A powerful shallow earthquake on a fault that sits partly under the Caribbean Sea. That is precisely the recipe that can shove a column of seawater and send it racing outward as a tsunami. So the center issued a tsunami advisory, and the places it named were American, Puerto Rico, the United States Virgin Islands, along with the Dominican Republic, sharing that same stretch of the Caribbean. The bulletins went out warning of the potential for hazardous tsunami currents and waves along those coastlines. Now, think about what that means for a second. An earthquake in Venezuela triggered an official tsunami threat for United States soil. For the roughly 3 million American citizens who live in Puerto Rico, and the tens of thousands in the US Virgin Islands, this was not a distant story on the news. For a few hours, it was a direct warning to get away from the water. Here's the good news, and I want to be honest about it rather than milk the fear. The advisory was cancelled that same evening. The tsunami that the models flagged as possible did not materialize into a destructive wave. The strike-slip motion of this fault, that sideways, horizontal sliding I described, is actually less efficient at generating big tsunamis than the other kind, where the seafloor thrusts violently up or down. So the ocean was disturbed, the threat was real enough to warn for, and then it passed. But do not let the all-clear lull you. The fact that the alarm sounded at all is the point. It tells you that this fault system is capable of reaching out and touching the United States, not in some hypothetical future, but on the night it ruptured. And it's a reminder of a pattern we see again and again in this part of the world. The Caribbean has a long, documented history of deadly tsunamis. In 1946, an earthquake in the Dominican Republic generated a wave that killed close to 2,000 people. The threat is not theoretical there, it's historical, and it's recurring. So the shaking came, the tsunami warning came, and then mercifully lifted. You might think the worst was over. The buildings that were going to fall had fallen. The wave didn't come. Surely now the danger curve starts bending down. It doesn't. And this is the part of the story that almost no headline is telling you, because the thing that does the most killing, in an earthquake like this, often isn't the earthquake at all. It's what the earthquake leaves behind. Let me show you the second threat, the one hiding underneath the rubble, literally underneath it. When the US Geological Survey models an earthquake's impact, it doesn't just estimate the shaking, it estimates secondary hazards. And for this event, one of those secondary alerts was also flagged red, at the highest level. Not the shaking, the ground itself failing. The culprit has a name that sounds almost gentle for what it does. Liquefaction. Here's what it is. A lot of coastal land, the kind you find all along the La Guaira shoreline and the low plains around Caracas, isn't solid bedrock. It's loose, water-saturated sediment, sand and silt with water filling the spaces between the grains. Normally, the friction between those grains holds everything firm enough to build a city on, but shake that ground hard enough, long enough, and the water pressure between the grains spikes. The grains lose contact with each other, and in a matter of seconds, Ground that felt as solid as concrete behaves like a liquid. Think of standing on wet sand at the beach. Stand still and it holds you. Now wiggle your feet, fast. You feel yourself start to sink. That is liquefaction in miniature. Now scale it up to an entire coastal city. Buildings don't just shake. They tilt. They sink. They topple over sideways onto foundations that have turned to slurry. Underground pipes float up. Roads buckle. The US Geological Survey estimated that the population living on top of high susceptibility ground in this earthquake numbered around 170,000 people. 170,000 standing on ground that could betray them. And there's a second hidden killer stacked on top of that one: landslides. Northern Venezuela isn't flat. Caracas and La Guaira are wedged between the sea and a steep coastal mountain range, the Cordillera de la Costa. When you hit slopes like that, with a magnitude 7.5, the hillsides come down, and this region has lived this nightmare before, in its worst form. In December of 1999, this exact stretch of coast, the state of Vargas, which is the old name for what's now La Guaira, was hit not by an earthquake, but by torrential rain. The saturated slopes of that same coastal range collapsed in enormous debris flows. Walls of mud, rock and water roared down onto the towns below. The death toll has never been precisely known, and estimates vary widely, but they run from around 10,000 people to as many as 30,000. It remains one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the Americas, and it happened on the very same fragile mountainsides that just absorbed two great earthquakes. So now layer it all together. You have a coastline where the flat ground can liquefy and the steep ground can slide. You have a healthcare system where 13 hospitals are damaged and doctors are treating the injured outdoors. You have a country that, even before this, was in deep political and economic crisis, with water and sanitation systems already failing. Pack tens of thousands of newly homeless people into shelters under those conditions, and you create the perfect setup for the slowest killer of all: disease, contaminated water, outbreaks. The earthquake's final victims may die weeks from now of something that has no name yet, in a shelter, far from any camera. That's the second threat, not the 90 seconds of shaking, the months that follow, and it raises the most urgent question survivors are asking right now. Is it over, or is the ground going to move again? Is it over? That's the question, and the honest answer is the kind of answer that doesn't fit in a headline. When a magnitude 7.5 strikes, the fault does not simply go quiet. It rings like a struck bell in a long sequence of aftershocks, and while most of those aftershocks are smaller, the chance of another big one in the days right after a great earthquake is real, and it is elevated. The US Geological Survey runs something called an operational aftershock forecast. It's a statistical model that estimates, in the days after a main shock, the odds of further large earthquakes. In the immediate aftermath of the Venezuela doublet, that forecast put the probability of another magnitude 7 or larger within the first week at around 4%, before revising it downward toward 2% as the sequence settled. Now, 2 to 4% might sound small, but think about what it represents. A 1 in 25 to 1 in 50 chance that a region already on its knees gets hit by another great earthquake, while rescuers are still inside collapsed buildings. That is why crews work knowing the ground could turn on them at any moment, and reports from the scene described exactly that: constant aftershocks, slowing the rescue, making every entry into a ruined building a gamble. For the smaller aftershocks, the numbers climb fast. After a magnitude 7.5, standard seismology expects hundreds of magnitude 4 or greater events, and potentially several magnitude 6 or greater, spread across the following weeks, each one a fresh threat to structures already cracked and leaning. But here is where I have to be straight with you about something, because being straight with you is the entire point of this channel. If you go to the global earthquake catalogs right now, the public feeds that list every quake worldwide, you will find surprisingly few aftershocks listed for this sequence. And that is not because the fault has gone silent. It's a limitation in the data itself. Remember what I told you earlier. The waves from the magnitude 7.2 and the magnitude 7.5 overlapped, stacking on top of each other in the recordings. That same problem haunts the aftershocks. The early aftershocks are buried inside the long, ringing tail of two great earthquakes that happened within a minute of each other. The automatic systems that detect and catalogue quakes struggle to pull those smaller signals out of that noise. Seismologists analyzing the sequence flagged this directly. The aftershocks are happening. We just can't cleanly see all of them yet in the global catalogue, and it will take days to weeks of careful hand analysis, much of it from Venezuela's own seismological agency, FUNVISIS, to fill in the real picture. I'm telling you this for a reason. Other channels will either ignore the aftershocks entirely, or they'll point at the nearly empty catalogue and spin some story about a cover-up, about data being hidden. There's no cover-up. There's a wave train and a hard signal processing problem, and scientists doing painstaking work to solve it. The truth is less dramatic than a conspiracy, and far more interesting once you understand it. So no, it is not over. The ground will keep moving for weeks. The forecast is uncertain, the catalogue is still filling in, and the smart move, the move the scientists are making, is to watch and wait, and not pretend to know more than the data allows. Now, we've covered the science of the present. To really understand the weight of what just happened, we have to go back more than 2 centuries, to another holiday and another Venezuelan city that fell in a matter of seconds. March 26, 1812, Holy Thursday. To understand why this earthquake cut so deep, not just into the ground but into the soul of a nation, you have to go back to that day. Because Venezuela has been here before, in almost unbearably similar circumstances, and the echo across 2 centuries is so exact, it's hard to look away from. It was the middle of the afternoon, Holy Week, the most sacred stretch of the Christian calendar, and the churches of Caracas were full. People had gathered to mark the day, and then the earth convulsed. A massive earthquake, estimated today at somewhere around magnitude 7, tore through the city. The churches, packed with worshippers, were among the first structures to come down. Stone and masonry collapsed onto the very crowds that had gathered to pray. The destruction was almost total. Contemporary accounts describe Caracas reduced to ruins in a matter of seconds, and the death toll was staggering for a city of its size. Estimates vary, as they always do for events this old, but historians generally place the dead between 15,000 and 20,000 people in a single afternoon. That may have been close to 1 in 20 residents of the affected region. Gone. But the 1812 earthquake didn't just kill people, it nearly killed a revolution, because this was no ordinary moment in Venezuelan history. The country was in the middle of its first war of independence from Spain. The new republic was barely a year old, and the earthquake struck hardest in the cities that had declared for independence, while sparing some of the regions still loyal to the Spanish crown. To a frightened, grieving population, that was not lost on them. Royalist clergy seized on it immediately, preaching that the quake was divine punishment for the rebellion against the king. And here is the moment that made it legend. The young revolutionary leader Simón Bolívar, the man who would go on to liberate much of South America, stood in the rubble of Caracas and, according to the account that has echoed down through history, declared that if nature itself opposed their independence, they would fight nature and force it to obey. Whether he said those exact words or not, the sentiment captured something real, a people who refused to read their own catastrophe as a verdict. So sit with the parallel for a moment. 1812, a holiday, churches and homes full of people, a magnitude 7 earthquake that flattens a city and shadows a nation's defining struggle. And then, 2026, June 24th, the holiday marking the Battle of Carabobo, another cornerstone of that same independence story. Homes full of people who weren't at work. 2 earthquakes, stronger than 1812, flattening the same coastal heart of the country. More than 200 years apart, the same fault system, the same kind of motion, struck on the same kind of day, against the same nation, in the same crippling combination of natural disaster and national crisis. That is not fate. That is not a curse, no matter how it feels to the people living through it. It is geology, the same plate boundary, grinding at the same patient pace, releasing its stored strain on its own schedule, indifferent to what day it is on a human calendar. The fault doesn't know it's a holiday. It never did. The tragedy of the timing is real, and it is also, in the coldest scientific sense, a coincidence of probability stacked on top of a population's habits. The 1812 quake left a scar that Venezuela never fully forgot, and now, 2 centuries later, the same ground has written another chapter. But 1812 isn't the closest match for what happened this week. For that, we have to look at 2 other events, one from the same coast, a little over a century ago, and one from the bottom of the world, just a few years ago, that explains the 39 seconds better than anything else on record. The US Geological Survey said something specific about this earthquake. It called the magnitude 7.5 the strongest to strike Venezuela since the San Narciso earthquake of 1900. So let's meet that one. October 29, 1900. An earthquake estimated at around magnitude 7.7 struck the same north-central coast of Venezuela, on or near the same San Sebastián plate boundary system. It rattled Caracas hard, caused significant damage along the coast, and stood for more than 120 years as the benchmark. The big one, the one every later quake was measured against, until this week, when the ground finally exceeded it. What that tells you is simple and important. This fault system produces great earthquakes on a roughly century to multi-century rhythm. 1812, 1900, 2026. These are not random shocks out of a clear sky. They are the recurring heartbeat of a plate boundary that has been doing this for millions of years, and will keep doing it for millions more. The science of this region predicted, in general terms, that an event like this would come. Not the day, not the hour, but the inevitability of it. Now for the second analogue, the one that cracks open the central mystery of this whole story, the 39 seconds. Travel to the far southern Atlantic, to a remote chain of frozen islands called the South Sandwich Islands. In August of 2021, almost nobody was living anywhere near them, so most people never heard about what happened there. But seismologists did, and they've been studying it ever since. An earthquake struck, a magnitude 7.5, and then, roughly 2.5 minutes later, a second, larger rupture tore the fault. A magnitude 8.1, 2 great earthquakes back to back, the second bigger than the first, the second hiding inside the seismic waves of the first, so that it took careful analysis just to untangle what had actually happened. Does that sound familiar? It should. It is the exact same signature as Venezuela. A foreshock, then a co-equal or larger mainshock, seconds to minutes later, on an adjacent stretch of fault, triggered by the stress handoff I described earlier. The South Sandwich event proved that the Earth does this. That a great earthquake can directly trigger another great earthquake almost immediately, through stress transfer, with no human cause and no exotic explanation. Venezuela isn't a freak. It's the second well-documented member of a club that scientists are only beginning to understand. And that matters for what comes next, because it means the doublet behavior of this fault is now part of the record. The next time it happens, somewhere in the world, the scientists will recognize it faster. The data from Venezuela, as painful as it is to collect, will save lives in some future event we can't even name yet. That's the strange grace buried in disaster science. Every catastrophe teaches the next generation of forecasters something the textbooks didn't contain. But behind every magnitude, every fault name, every probability, there are people. And this disaster reached far beyond Venezuela's borders, into living rooms across the United States, in a way the maps don't show. There are roughly 600,000 people of Venezuelan origin living in the United States. Sit with that number for a second, because it changes what this story is. This is not a faraway earthquake in a country most Americans will never visit. For hundreds of thousands of families in Florida, in the New York and New Jersey area, in Texas, in cities across this country, the footage coming out of Caracas and La Guaira is footage of home, of the neighborhood they grew up in, of the building an aunt or a grandfather still lives in. And in the hours after the quake, those families ran into a wall almost as cruel as the disaster itself: silence. Because Venezuela has one of the most restricted information environments on Earth. In the aftermath, Monitoring groups reported that more than 200 websites were blocked inside the country, including local and international news, social media, and the tools people use to get around censorship. So picture it. You're in Miami. You've just seen that the strongest earthquake in over a century hit the exact coast where your family lives. And you cannot reach them. You cannot find them on the news. You cannot get a message through. The United Nations actually had to publicly urge Venezuelan authorities to restore access to communication networks, warning that in the hours and days after a disaster, timely access to information would be vital to protecting lives. That is a specific, modern kind of agony. The disaster, and then the blackout on top of it. And the United States did not just watch. The US government deployed some of its most capable urban search and rescue teams to Venezuela. First, the teams designated USA-1 and USA-2, the elite federal task forces based in Fairfax County, Virginia, and Los Angeles County, California. Then, as the scale of the catastrophe became clear, officials activated and federalized additional teams out of Miami-Dade, Florida, which reporting described as the first time in over a decade that the United States had sent search and rescue task forces beyond those two primary federal teams. American crews even repaired one of the runways at Simón Bolívar International Airport to keep aid flowing in, alongside roughly 30 international rescue teams from across the hemisphere. I'm not going to put words in the mouth of any one survivor I can't verify. I won't invent a name or a quote for emotional effect, because that's exactly the kind of fabrication this channel refuses to do. But I don't need to invent anything. The verified facts are devastating enough. Volunteers digging through 9 stories of collapsed concrete with their bare hands because there wasn't enough heavy machinery. A 15-year-old girl located alive, trapped high inside a fallen building in Catia La Mar by a rescue team from El Salvador. Families spending the night in the street, too afraid of aftershocks to go back inside cracked homes, carrying out what little they could salvage. Cookies, water, a change of clothes. The arithmetic of survival, reduced to what fits in your arms. This is the human cost, not an abstraction. 600,000 Americans with a direct stake, an entire diaspora refreshing their phones, and a coastline full of people doing the work of rescue by hand. Which leaves one more question we owe them an honest answer to. Why did the buildings fall the way they did? Because the earthquake was the trigger. But the buildings were a choice made long before June 24th. Here's an uncomfortable truth that seismologists say out loud, even though it sounds harsh. Earthquakes don't kill people. Collapsing buildings kill people. The shaking is the hazard. But whether that shaking turns into a death toll of dozens or a death toll in the thousands comes down almost entirely to what's standing when the ground moves. And in northern Venezuela, what was standing told a story of decades of crisis, written in concrete. Let me explain the physics of why these particular buildings came down, because it's not random, and it's not bad luck. Most of the deadly collapses in events like this share a few specific, well-understood failure modes. The first is something engineers call soft story collapse. Picture an apartment building with an open ground floor. Maybe it's parking, maybe it's shops. Big open spaces with few walls. The floors above are heavy and rigid, full of dividing walls. When the earthquake hits, that weak, open ground floor can't resist the sideways force. It folds, and the entire heavy building above pancakes, straight down onto it, floor onto floor onto floor. It's one of the deadliest failure patterns there is, because it leaves almost no survivable space in between. The second failure mode is about the concrete itself. Reinforced concrete is strong only when the steel inside it is detailed correctly. The steel bars, the rebar, have to be tied together with closely spaced hoops, especially at the joints where columns meet beams, so the structure can flex and sway without shattering. Skimp on that steel, space the hoops too far apart, use weak concrete to save money, and the columns don't bend in an earthquake. They explode. They burst at the joints, and the building loses the very skeleton holding it up. Now connect that to Venezuela's reality. This is a country that has spent years in profound economic collapse, building maintenance deferred, new construction often informal, unregulated, built without engineering oversight or modern seismic codes. by people who had no other option for housing. Add the corrosive coastal air of La Guaira eating at the rebar inside aging concrete for decades, and you get a building stock that was, in many cases, quietly primed to fail. The earthquake didn't create that vulnerability, it just found it. Every shortcut, every skipped inspection, every bag of substandard concrete from years past, the magnitude 7.5 collected on all of it in about 90 seconds. And this is the lesson that travels, because the difference between Venezuela and, say, Japan or Chile or California isn't the size of the earthquakes. Those places get great earthquakes too. The difference is the building codes, and crucially, the enforcement of them. After the 1971 Silmar earthquake, California rewrote its codes and spent decades retrofitting exactly those soft-story buildings. It is the single most effective form of disaster prevention ever invented, and it's invisible, because it's measured in the catastrophes that don't happen. The grim truth out of Venezuela is that a strong earthquake will always test a city's buildings. The only question decided in advance, long before the fault ever moves, is whether those buildings will pass. Which brings us to the part of this story that I've been building toward. Because while real engineers were reading the rubble for these lessons, a very different story was already spreading online. A story that says this earthquake wasn't natural at all. Within hours of the second rupture, before the dust had settled, before a single body had been recovered, the other story was already spreading. It always is. You've probably seen the claims that this earthquake was no accident, that two quakes 39 seconds apart is impossible in nature, so something must have caused it. The candidates are always the same: a secret weapon, a covert underground nuclear test. The old favorite, HAARP, that research facility in Alaska, that a certain corner of the internet believes can summon earthquakes and control the weather. The 39 seconds, in particular, gets held up as the smoking gun. Nature doesn't repeat that fast, the argument goes, so someone must have pulled a trigger. I want to take that seriously, and then I want to take it apart. Not with mockery, with physics, because the real answer is more interesting than the conspiracy, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the energy. The magnitude 7.5 released seismic energy on the order of 100 quintillion joules. To put that in human terms, it's in the range of tens of megatons of TNT. Now consider HAARP, the actual facility, not the myth. It's an ionospheric research array. Its total transmitter power is around 3.6 megawatts. Radio waves beamed up into the thin upper atmosphere, hundreds of kilometers above the ground. The total energy HAARP could put out, running flat for its entire operational history, is something like 10 orders of magnitude smaller than this single earthquake. 10 orders of magnitude. That's the difference between $1 and $10 billion. And on top of that, radio energy in the upper atmosphere doesn't, and physically can't, propagate down through tens of kilometers of solid rock to unzip a fault. It's not a question of secrecy. It's a question of the energy not being remotely in the same universe. Now the nuclear test idea. This one actually has a clean, decisive answer, and it comes from the seismic data itself. When you analyze an earthquake, you can compute something called a moment tensor. It's a mathematical description of the motion at the source, and it tells you what kind of event produced the waves. An explosion, like a bomb, pushes outward in all directions at once. It has a distinct signature. A fault rupture does something completely different. It's a shearing motion, two blocks sliding past each other. For the Venezuela mainshock, the US Geological Survey's solution showed a double couple component of over 96%. In plain English, the math says this was almost purely shear faulting, sliding rock. Not an explosion. An explosion would have lit up the signature in the opposite way. And here's the part the conspiracy never accounts for. We have a global system specifically built to catch secret nuclear tests. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization runs a worldwide network of seismic, infrasound, and underwater sound sensors designed to detect a clandestine detonation anywhere on the planet. A nuclear test large enough to mimic a magnitude 7.5 would be the loudest, most obvious event that network has ever recorded. It is not something you can hide. The fact that no such detection occurred isn't an absence of evidence, it's positive evidence of absence. So what about the 39 seconds? By now you already know the answer, because I gave it to you back at the start. Static and dynamic stress transfer. One fault segment ruptures and hands its stress to the next, both as a permanent shove and as a passing shockwave, and the next segment, already loaded, lets go. We have watched this happen in slow motion before. The 1992 Landers earthquake in California is a textbook case, where one rupture triggered a cascade of stress changes that scientists tracked across the region. The South Sandwich Doublet of 2021 did it in minutes. Venezuela did it in 39 seconds. Fast triggering isn't evidence of a weapon. It's evidence of exactly how interconnected and dangerous real fault systems are. So here's where I land, and I want to say it plainly, because it's the whole reason this channel exists. The conspiracy version of this earthquake is, in a strange way, comforting. Think about it. If a secret weapon caused this, then someone is in control. There's a hand on the lever, a villain you can name, a plot you can expose, a reason. The universe stays orderly, even if it's evil. That's the quiet appeal underneath all of it, the need for there to be someone responsible. The scientific truth is so much harder to sit with, because the truth is that no one is in control. There was no hand on the lever. There was just a slab of rock, deep underground, that had been silently storing strain for over a century, 20 millimeters a year, thumb width by thumb width, since before anyone watching this was born. And on a Wednesday evening, on a holiday, with homes full of people, it reached its limit and let go, and then handed the rest of its stored violence to the fault segment next door, which let go too, 39 seconds later, indifferent, unplanned, following nothing but the laws of physics and the patient arithmetic of stress and friction. That is the unsettling part. Not that someone did this, that no one did, that this is simply what the planet does, on its own schedule, and that the same process is winding up right now under cities all over the world, including our own. The fault under Los Angeles is loading at this very moment, exactly the way the San Sebastián was. There is no one to blame and no one to stop it. There is only the science that lets us see it coming, the engineering that decides who lives, and the honesty to look at it clearly, instead of hiding inside a story that makes us feel safer. The truth is more unsettling than the conspiracy. It almost always is, and it's also the only version that can actually save anyone, because you cannot prepare for a weapon that doesn't exist. You can prepare for an earthquake that does. So what happens next? Where does this story go from here? In the immediate term, the answer is rescue, then recovery, racing against time and aftershocks. As I record this, the confirmed death toll has climbed past 1,400, with more than 3,000 injured and tens of thousands reported missing, and every one of those numbers carries the painful caveat that they are still moving, still incomplete, still rising as crews reach places they couldn't reach before. The state of La Guaira, the hardest hit, had still not been fully counted days in, so treat any single figure you see, including the ones I just gave you, as a snapshot of a moment, not a final tally. The real number will take weeks to settle, and the honest thing is to say so. Scientifically, the work is just beginning. Venezuela's own seismological agency, FUNVISIS, along with the US Geological Survey and researchers around the world, will spend months reconstructing exactly what these faults did. They'll map the rupture. They'll finally pull those buried aftershocks out of the overlapping wave trains. They'll settle the open question of whether this was truly two events or one complex rupture wearing the mask of two, and they'll fold every answer into the models that forecast the next one, here, and on every fault like it, including the ones running under the United States. For the next several weeks, the watch continues. The aftershock sequence will keep going, smaller and smaller on average, but with that small, real, elevated chance of another large event that has crews looking over their shoulders. If you want to follow the real data instead of the rumors, the US Geological Survey publishes its operational aftershock forecast and updates it as the sequence evolves. FUNVISIS publishes its own bulletins. That's where the truth will be, updated quietly, without drama, as the science comes in. And the deepest question this leaves behind isn't really about Venezuela at all. It's the one I want you to carry out of this video. If a fault almost no one had heard of, moving at the speed your fingernails grow, can do this in 39 seconds. What is the fault you have heard of? The one moving even faster, the one under millions of Americans doing right now, in the silence, while no one is watching. Here's the one thing to take with you. 2 great earthquakes struck Venezuela 39 seconds apart, not because anyone willed it, but because a century of stored strain on a strike-slip fault released the way physics says it must, and handed its violence to the fault next door. The shaking was the trigger. The buildings and the choices behind them were the verdict, and the same machine is running under California. If there's a practical takeaway, it's this. The earthquake you can't prevent, you can still survive, and the difference is decided long before the ground ever moves. It's decided by how the building over your head was made, by whether you know where to go in the first 10 seconds, by whether your community took the boring, invisible work of preparation seriously while the ground was still. Venezuela is the most expensive reminder imaginable that the time to care about that is now, not after. I'm not going to wrap this up in a neat bow, because it isn't neat. The death toll is still rising as I speak. The faults are still settling. The question of what our own ground does next is still open, and it will stay open until the day it isn't. But I'll leave you with this. We talked tonight about a fault hiding offshore, under the sea, that almost no one was watching. There's another one we should be watching just as closely, and it's not under the ocean. It's a volcano in American territory that just did something it has not done in recorded history, on a clock so regular that scientists can now almost predict the next eruption to the day. Most people have no idea it's happening. I'll show you what the ground in Hawaii is telling us, and why the experts are watching it the way you'd watch a countdown. That's the next one. I'll see you there.